And I'm going to talk to you about eugenics. Eugenics is a very important topic for pro-life because we have to understand the motivations of the people who are spreading abortion. Why do they do it? Why do people want to kill babies? It doesn't make any sense. It's not natural. And as other speakers have said, it's a supernatural problem. It's a spiritual problem. It's a diabolical thing. But it's also ideological, an ideology. And eugenics is really the source of this. It's one of the principal sources of the anti-life organizations, the anti-life principles. So what is eugenics? Well, this image here is from the Second International Conference of Eugenics from 1921. And eugenics really started in the 19th century, end of the 19th century, and then was really at its peak at the beginning of the 20th century. But the eugenics people themselves said, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. That we will control the human race, the human population in the future. And it claimed to be scientific. And one of the things that is very striking about eugenics is it has very British roots, very English roots. One of the very first people with eugenics thoughts was Thomas Malthus. And Malthus was an Anglican clergyman. And he wrote an essay on the principle of population in 1798. He is the father of what's called Malthusianism. And the idea is that the world is overpopulated. There are too many people. Already in the 18th century, there are too many people, and so we have to control population. And we particularly have to control the people who are inferior, the people who are less. And so that is the essence, really, of Malthusianism, of population control, eugenics, that some people are superior and we need to have more of those people, and some people are inferior and we need to have less of those people. And it's a terrible, terrible ideology. The term itself, eugenics, comes from the Greek. So, eu meaning good, and then genics meaning genes, so good genes. Francis Galton coined the term, he created the term eugenics, and he was a cousin of Charles Darwin. And he was very influenced by Darwinism. In fact, Darwin himself, had this eugenic idea that, competition of species, etc., but competition of human beings, and only the strong will survive. And that all the weak, etc., will be just killed off, etc., and we should have social Darwinism, in a sense, that only the superior races will continue. And Dalton said this, the science of improving human stock to give more suitable races a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. And the British Empire was the largest empire in the world. It covered, the sun never set on the empire, large parts of Asia and Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, etc. And the British had a very racist attitude in how they ran their empire. The big difference between the Spanish Empire and the British Empire is that the British never mixed with the people they conquered. Whereas the Spanish mixed in the mestizo races, etc. They didn't have this sense that there was like racial separation. Apartheid, that type of thing is more of a British or a Dutch idea. But this ideology of eugenics became very dominant in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And these images here were the classification of immigrants that was in the United States, 1918. And they showed the immigration officials these images, and they said, if you spot these types of people, you keep them from coming into the United States. that they are, high-grade imbeciles, morons, inferior races of different kinds, etc. Keep them out. And this was acceptable by the federal government in the United States, that we will classify entire peoples and whatnot as being inferior. There was one person, and just the title of his book, Lothrop Stoddard, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. I mean, just the title of the book, you know what's in it. And he was on the board of directors of Margaret Sanger's American Birth Control League. So Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood, who is the largest force today in terms of promoting abortion around the world, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, Planned Parenthood Federation of America, all throughout the Americas, because the American Planned Parenthood Federation supports the work of Planned Parenthood all throughout the Americas, in Mexico and all throughout South America. They had this racist, eugenicist origin, mentality. And Stoddard was so bad that he was a very important person, a VIP guest for the Nazis. And he was giving speaking tours in Nazi Germany in the 1930s. And Hitler was a big fan. He said, Lothrop Stoddard, he's really good. And he was on the board of directors for Margaret Sanger, and they got along really well. The Catholic Church reacted against this eugenicist ideology. The decree of the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, today it would be the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued this decree March 18th, 1931. The theory of eugenics is to be held entirely blamable, false, and to be condemned in accordance with the encyclical on Christian marriage, Casti Connubii, which was from 1930. So the church reacted very strongly, against this terrible ideology that some people are superior to other people, that you have different races that, can be oppressed or eliminated. The eugenicists really wanted to wipe out entire peoples. In Australia, the Aboriginal peoples were almost exterminated by the English settlers, and they would shoot them like they would shoot animals, just to get rid of the inferior peoples, they thought. Well, the most famous eugenicist regime was the Third Reich, was Nazi Germany. And Margaret Sanger published in her Birth Control Review an article entitled Eugenic Sterilization, an Urgent Need. The author was Ernst Rudin, who was co-founder of the Nazi Society for Racial Hygiene and Hitler's director of genetic sterilization. So Margaret Sanger, who later on started Planned Parenthood, etc., was in this current of thought that, what we need to do is create contraception, sterilization, abortion to get rid of undesirable people. And generally that was the poor, the Catholics, and different races that weren't sort of Nordic. Northern European was the gold standard, the Aryan races. Well, in Germany, they had some of these propaganda posters and things. And there was always kind of a hysteria, right? The wrong people are having too many children. So in this, they were talking about criminals having an average of 4.9 children, and 4.4 children, parents of slow learners. 3.5 children, from other families. But the educated people only having 1.9 children. And the great fear of the eugenicists always is that, the right people are not having enough children and the wrong people are having too many. So what the eugenicists always tried to do was sterilize entire categories of people. And it's incredible. I mean, some of these eugenic programs lasted until the 1970s. In Sweden, they sterilized upwards of 70,000 people all the way up until the 1970s. In Japan, they had eugenic sterilization going on. In the United States, in certain states like Virginia, et cetera, they continued for years and years. So what happened? After World War II, the main eugenicist country had been Nazi Germany, the whole movement was discredited. I mean, you couldn't claim to be a eugenicist anymore because that meant you were a Nazi, and so they had to change their name, they had to hide, and make new names for all their organizations, etc. But the new organizations, the National Abortion Rights Action League, the National Organization for Women, said that abortion should be legal because the most prolific breeders were welfare mothers from the dangerous classes. So the eugenicist movement turned into the abortion movement. NARAL, Planned Parenthood, National Organization for Women, these people said, okay, how do we get rid of the poor? How do we get rid of the people we don't like? Well, we promote abortion. And if you look at all these, the Population Council, I was working in Guatemala, and I was going down there with Clínica Corpus Christi. We were bringing doctors down. We were doing jornadas médicas. We were doing operations for the poor in Chimaltenango, mostly Mayan Indian origin people. And we were there to help. And we created a little clinic, hospital, etc. And the Population Council came to the clinic and they said, oh, we see you're doing great work. You have a surgical suite, all these things. We have all this money. We want to help you. And we're like, oh, great, wonderful. And they said, we have a program, materno-infantil, mothers and children. Ah, wonderful. We love helping mothers and children. Yes, it has a family planning component. Well, we're in favor of natural methods, of fertility regulation. We can help with all. Well, actually, we want to do sterilizations. We want to do massive sterilizations, and you have a surgical center here, and we will give you lots of money, but we will sterilize all the people we can get a hold of. They're like, oh, no, go away. But they would go to the midwives, and they said, for every woman that you convince to have a sterilization, we will give you money. And they taught them how to do this. The woman has just had her child. Very difficult situation. She's kind of suffering from postpartum depression. Her hormones are a little bit, out of whack, etc. And the midwife says, look, you should get, a ligation, ligadura de trompas, and put pressure on these women in a very vulnerable situation to go get sterilized. And they didn't do it in our clinic, in Clínica Corpus Christi, but they found other places to do it. And this was the Population Council. It was John D. Rockefeller III who founded it. He was a co-founder with Frederick Osborne, president of the American Eugenics Society. So hand in hand, this eugenics. They even shared the same address in New York City. And Planned Parenthood, from the very beginning, all the leaders, from Margaret Sanger, but Secretary Generals of IPPF, the International Planned Parenthood Federation, were all from this eugenics movement. And they were trying to push this global population control, global sterilization. As soon as you find someone who's really pushing sterilization, you can be almost 100% sure that they're from the eugenics movement. There's a Dr. Stephen Mumford, who's in North Carolina. And he goes around the world and he does these chloroquine sterilizations. And what he does is he inserts this acid into the fallopian tubes, next to the fallopian tubes, to scar them, chemically burn them, and sterilize women. And he can do it very quickly because he's just putting in these little tablets. But this is a method that was actually developed by the Nazis. And he uses it today, but he only does it in poor countries or on racial minority people. And it's very clear why he's out sterilizing, because he doesn't like black and brown people. It's a terrible thing. But the sterilization is definitely one of their favorite approaches. Marie Stopes in the UK, she founded Marie Stopes International. Besides Planned Parenthood, Marie Stopes is one of the next biggest abortion promoters in the world. We meet them a lot in Africa, and they're present. But in her book, Radiant Motherhood, what a name for her book, She said, society allows the diseased, the racially negligent, the thriftless, the careless, the feeble-minded, the very lowest and worst members of the community to produce innumerable tens of thousands of stunted, warped, inferior infants. I mean, that kind of racism. And she actually had a son, Marie Stopes had a son, who required eyeglasses. So his vision wasn't quite perfect, and she put him away, and she says, you are not my son, because you require eyeglasses, and so you must be inferior because I don't need eyeglasses, and how could you? I mean, she was completely crazy. But not only was she crazy, she was influential. I mean, she started an organization that gets millions and millions of British pounds, and they work all over the world. I mean, it's sad that these organizations actually are able to function. In the United States, abortion centers are disproportionately located in minority areas, and this is done on purpose. Planned Parenthood opens its abortion centers in places where there are blacks or Hispanics. That's their target population. The US federal government pays 90% of the cost of sterilizing poor women. They're like, a poor person wants to be sterilized, the government will pay for that. A poor person is suffering from infertility, is not able to have children. No, there's no money from the federal government to pay for that. They're just in favor of, stopping fertility, not helping people. And so this is why we should be concerned. The eugenics people pioneered all the major birth control methods. So sterilization was their first thing, but the birth control pill was a product of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was looking for the magic pill for birth control. And so she actually sponsored the research, and actually another eugenicist helped her, who inherited the McCormick Harvester fortune, another woman, paid for the research to create the birth control pill. And then when it was tested, a lot of it was tested in Puerto Rico and on Puerto Rican women, and many of the women died while they were trying to get the right dosages for the pill, et cetera. But they didn't mind that because they wanted to get this birth control so they could have international population control eventually. And all these groups, so they sponsor abortion, they sponsor population control, they sponsor euthanasia. And very interesting to see, the eugenicist movement, they wanted to kill the unfit. And so one of the first things that the Nazis did when they came into power was to go to the mental asylums, to go to the orphanages, and to empty them out and euthanize, kill all these people, because they were useless eaters, is how the term they like to use. Useless mouths to feed. And the really courageous Catholic bishop, von Galen, the Bishop of Munster, stood up and he said, no, this program of euthanasia cannot stand. And he stood up to Hitler, even though it was in a totalitarian government, and he actually forced the Nazis to back down. I mean, it's incredible that a Bishop von Galen, just with his personal strength, he had no troops, he had no power, but he had his voice and his authority. And he said, this is not going to happen. And Hitler actually got scared, and they moved their euthanasia program from an open program to a hidden program. And they were no longer going openly to kill people. But euthanasia is a big part of eugenics as well. In vitro fertilization, the idea of creating human beings in laboratories, that is a eugenicist dream. They love the idea, we can pick and choose who is going to be created. That's wonderful. One of the original ideas of International Planned Parenthood Federation was to put a sterilizing agent in something like the water supply or the food or something like this to make everybody sterile, and then to have the antidote and to give the antidote to people who should be having children, and everybody else would be sterile. Now, technically, they weren't able to do it. It's a difficult, but that was their dream. Their goal was to only allow people to have children that we think are good people to have children from the right stock. And of course, in China, the Chinese birth control policy very much has a eugenicist bent to it. This idea of controlling the population, only having certain people allowed to have children, etc. And so, this is what the eugenicists promised when they were trying to get abortion legalized. Legal abortion will decrease the number of unwanted children. Battered children, child abuse cases, subsequent delinquency, drug addiction, a host of social ills believed to be associated with neglectful parenthood. So this is from 1974. Abortion was legalized in 1973. They're saying, oh, abortion is going to give us all this wonderful thing. There'll be so much less child abuse, unwanted children, etc. Because now we have abortion. Daniel Callahan, who was an academic actually involved in bioethics and a very liberal, anti-Catholic, originally from a Catholic background, but very much against the teachings of the church, said to withhold the possibility of a safe and socially acceptable abortion for unmarried women is to start the chain of illegitimacy and despair that will continue to keep poverty and crime and poor mental health high on the list of pressing social problems. So abortion will solve our problems. That all the poor, instead of having poor children, they will just have abortions, and any unwanted child will be aborted, and then everything will be wonderful. That's Planned Parenthood's vision. Every child a wanted child. And the chief of police there in Minneapolis, Anthony Buzza, clearly racist here. When abortions are illegal, poor women deliver and keep their babies. Then they plunk them in front of a TV set, watch them get abused and conditioned to violence by parades of males, expose them to all the factors the criminologists describe as the precursors to a life of crime, but making abortions freely available to the impoverished young women who produce our criminals is very likely the most important crime prevention measure adopted in this country in the last 25 years. And the culture of death, I really like to make a contrast, right? The culture of life and the culture of death. The solutions of the culture of death are always a quick fix, a technical fix. So you have a problem pregnancy, difficulty with the pregnancy. What do? You kill the baby. Boom. Quick solution. The pro-life solution. There's a problem with this pregnancy. The mother is from a very poor background, or the child, possibly has a handicap, or the husband is not there, etc. What do? You provide help. You accompany that person throughout 9 months of pregnancy, and then you help them after birth. And it's really, a lot of work to be pro-life, and to have a pro-life solution. But the abortionist, 15 minutes in a surgical suite, and we've solved your problem. You have a person who's at the end of life, who's suffering, who, doesn't understand the meaning of their life anymore, who's lonely, who's depressed, etc. The culture of death says, okay, quick injection, euthanasia, next problem. The culture of life solution is you have to go and help these people. You have to provide them with real health care, palliative care if they're suffering from pain. You have to help them out of their depression. You have to accompany them into eternal life. It takes a lot more time, a lot more energy. But, it's the right thing to do as opposed to the culture of death, which is boom, get rid of the person. Culture of death solution to, economic situation or health situation which makes pregnancy, having another child, a problem. Birth control. Boom. Just take a pill and no problem. The culture of life solution, well, you have to learn the rhythms of biology. You have to learn the natural methods. You have abstinence, in the times of the fertile periods, etc. It takes a lot more work but it's also, not destroying nature. It's working together in a loving way, et cetera, et cetera. But the culture of death, is this quick fix and always with this anti-human mentality, this racist mentality. So, things like this: fight crime, abort black babies. That's basically the view of the culture of death. It's the view of Planned Parenthood. I mean, they put their abortion centers in black neighborhoods because they want to see fewer black babies, because they think society will be better without these minorities. And if you look at the statistics in America, with all the abortions since Roe v. Wade, 11% of the white Anglo-Saxon population has been aborted. 15% of the Asian or Pacific Islander population has suffered through abortions. Hispanics, about 15% as well. And the black population, 31%. The abortion rate for African American women in the United States is twice as high as it is for white America. And it's clearly targeting of certain groups. And they make this argument explicit. Legalized abortion contributed to the recent crime reductions. Legalized abortion appears to account for as much as 50% of the recent drop in crime. This is from the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2001. They say, look, if we abort all these people from poor backgrounds, et cetera, we'll have less crime because we're killing the criminals even before they're born. And Henry Morgentaler, who's a famous Canadian abortionist, said, unwanted children are often neglected and abused. And then they have all these other problems. And then when you legalize abortion, these unwanted children are not born. And so there are fewer violent individuals with rage in their hearts. And it's obviously the main reason for the decrease in crime, especially violent crime. So the abortionists were making this argument. We need abortion to lower the crime rate. As incredible as that sounds. And there was a famous book called Freakonomics. And it was a bunch of economists who were basically saying, if abortion has saved so much money by getting rid of so many people that would have been criminals. And these are the assumptions that they were coming forward. So aborted children are unwanted children. They would have grown up in a home with parents that do not love them, and so they'd be more prone to crime. And abortion gets rid of certain demographic groups disproportionately, usually African Americans. And the crazy thing is, when you looked at the crime rates, 18 years after Roe v. Wade, the crime rate had decreased. So murder had decreased by 45%, and rape by 31%, and robbery by 47%. So it seemed like their argument was working, right? It seemed like what they were saying was true, or they could, have statistical corroboration. Property crimes were declining, et cetera. And they showed on graphs like this, the crime rates were going down. But the problem was, this was ergo hoc propter hoc fallacy, right? Just because something happens after something else doesn't mean that the first thing caused the second thing. And so you have to go deeper into, what was really going on. And the first rule of any good study is it has to be replicable. You have to recreate the same study in different places to show that there's a causal link with something. If it works in one place, it should work everywhere. So what happened in other countries after they legalized abortion? For instance, in Canada. Well, the abortion laws were struck down, and then the crime rate stayed very similar. Actually went higher and then continued on these lines. So why did the crime rate decrease in the United States 18 years and on after Roe v. Wade? Well, there was more policing going on. A lot of criminals were taken off the streets. There was a waning of the crack epidemic. It seems like that's the main. Crack cocaine was introduced in the United States in the 1980s. And you had a situation with drugs coming into the United States, and drug addicts were doing anything they could to get more drugs. And so they were, committing crimes, et cetera, and the crack epidemic led to a huge increase in crime. When the epidemic came under control, the crime rate went down. It has nothing to do with abortion, it has everything to do with crack cocaine. There were also better policing that was put in place. At New York City, they had a very interesting program on windows. They found that buildings that had broken windows invited crime. And if they replaced the broken windows, the crime rate went down. And it was like human psychology, et cetera. If you crack down on petty crimes, then more severe crimes are impeded. If you stop people who are at the first stage of being criminals, then they don't graduate to rape and murder, et cetera. And just economically, things got better in the 1990s. But abortion actually increases the number of unwanted children. And how is that possible? Comparative perceived risk. When abortion is illegal, people know that if they get pregnant, they're going to have that baby. And there's no easy way to have an abortion. So people are much more careful in a situation where abortion is illegal. There's a more sort of strong attitude of having to prevent that. There was a study that was published by The Lancet. So this is a medical journal in the UK. It was about seatbelts. And when they passed the seatbelt law in the UK, so you had to wear a seatbelt in your car, they assumed that the mortality rate would go down on the streets, on the highways, because people are safer if they're wearing a seatbelt. But the accident rate and the mortality rate went up. And they were like, why are there more accidents now that people are wearing seatbelts? And the answer was people felt safe. They felt, I'm wearing my seatbelt, I'm safe, I can drive really fast, I can go like this on the road, etc. I'm safe because I'm wearing my seatbelt. But if you have an accident and you're wearing your seatbelt, you're still at a risk of dying. They're having more accidents because they felt safe, they were wearing their seatbelts. It was the exact same problem with condoms and AIDS. There were all these campaigns that went out saying, condoms are the solution to AIDS. If you wear a condom, then you won't catch AIDS, safe sex. Yeah, but the condoms have a failure rate. The condoms are not very effective. They have all kinds of problems with them. And so the user failure rate for condoms can be 10, 15, 20%. And of course, if you're having a lot of unsafe sex with all kinds of different people and you have a failure rate, you're eventually going to catch AIDS. So people feel safe, but they're not safe. Well, when abortion is legal, it's seen as kind of a safety net. And premarital sex becomes more and more common. People say, I can just sleep with anybody. And it becomes more socially acceptable. And there's more pressure on all women to engage in it. And this includes women who would never have an abortion themselves. So you have greater promiscuity, and then these out-of-wedlock births just go up and up and up. So this is the statistics from the United States. But you can see in 1960, it was like 5% of children were born outside of marriage. And now, we're up to 45% of children born. So all these poor children that are born outside of marriage that are, unwanted children in a certain sense, it creates family breakdown. And children who don't grow up with a father in the house have much more problems. This is just a little bit of statistics on children who have difficulty in school. From single parents, 30%. From married parents, only 20%. Children suspended or expelled from school, twice as many from single parents as from married parents. Children in poor health, over twice as many than those from married parents. The chief reason for poverty in the United States is single motherhood, children who don't have a father who's living with them. And so abortion has contributed to that by the sexual revolution contraception as well, but moving towards this children without a father. And that, of course, contributes directly to criminality. But the solution of the culture of death, I was also like a problem like homelessness, the problem of the homeless. If you look at all the different solutions, right, the culture of life solution to homelessness is to go out and help the homeless, to bring them food, to try and find housing for them, to find social situations, etc. But what would be the culture of death solution to homelessness? Well, they've done it in China. You pick up all the homeless people on the streets, and you either throw them in jail or you kill them. Because you just get rid of the problem quick, as opposed to the culture of life solution, which involves a lot of work, etc., but is a real solution, Christian one. So, another interesting thing about abortion, those who engage in abortion, particularly abortionists, become criminals, disproportionate rates of them. And in the medical profession, doctors who do abortions are incredibly violent people. So this is John Baxter Hamilton. He murdered his wife. This is Malachi DeHenry, again, abortion doctor who killed his wife. Alicia Ruiz Hanna, abortionist, who killed one of her clients, Angela Nieto Sanchez. On and on and on. Brian Finkel, he molested the women who were coming to him for abortions, over 100 of his clients. The famous Kermit Gosnell, who was there in Philadelphia, there's that film, really very good film about him. He murdered, I think it's about 250 children. They were born alive, and then he snapped their necks with scissors. They consider him the largest mass murderer in U.S. history because he killed so many children after birth. Of course, there are abortionists who've killed thousands and thousands in the womb, but he would actually deliver some of these babies alive and then kill them. When I go to different countries, and Human Life International, we're always in different countries, and they talk about the U.S. pro-life movement. They say, the U.S. pro-lifers are terrible, that they're terrorists. They kill abortionists, and they explode bombs in abortion centers, etc. And since 1973, since the legalization of abortion in America, there have been eight so-called pro-life murders. Crazy people, etc., who killed abortion doctors, etc. 8 of them. Abortionists, so people who commit abortion, etc., who killed their patients, or women who refused to have an abortion who were murdered, etc., just the ones we know about, we found are over 420. And frequently you don't hear about it. There was a case of an abortionist, who went around on a killing spree. He killed several people, and when the story was published in the newspaper, it was Dr. Such and Such was just convicted of murder, etc., and they never mentioned the fact that his main job was committing abortions. So, they kind of sweep it under the rug. But it's clear, the culture of death thrives on death and murder. The culture of life, on the other hand, does not. Well, when all this new science came out, this brave new world, eugenicists were so excited about mapping the human genome, understanding all the genes and DNA, etc., of the human beings, genetic testing. That's the dream of the eugenicists, right, is to have everybody genetically tested to see who is got complete, wonderful heredity and DNA and genetics, and they will be allowed to have children. And everybody else who has a possibility of genetic disease, etc., they should be sterilized or gotten rid of. And the best thing to do is to create human life inside of laboratories, in vitro fertilization, where they can manipulate the genes and create super people, especially intelligent, designer babies. So you can go in and say, well, I'd like my baby to have this and that and all these different traits. And there's a eugenicist fertility clinic in California, it actually has sperm from Nobel Prize winners. So you can buy the sperm of the Nobel Prize winner in physics or medicine, etc. And so you can have a super intelligent baby, that type of thing. But that's the eugenicist mentality, that we need to create this super race. And really what eugenics is a diabolical temptation, right? I mean, we replace God's will with man's will. Darwinism on steroids. Darwinism pushed to the ultimate extent, right? We are in control of the evolution of the human species. We are going to create the super person. But Christianity is totally incompatible with this kind of racism and discrimination against the poor or mentally handicapped or anybody else. It's really the polar opposite. And I feel terrible for these transhumanists. I mean, the eugenicists today are in the abortion movement. That's kind of where they're most active, population control movement. But theoretically, they're into transhumanism. The idea that we're going to create this human machine mix, kind of a cyborg, a Terminator type creature, and will live forever. The transhumanists are always talking about living forever, but on Earth. So you replace all the body parts with artificial body parts, and pretty much the only thing left at the end is the brain. And then you will then become this kind of hybrid creature, that can live forever. And it's not heaven, it's hell. I mean, what kind of life would it be to be like a disembodied brain with a mechanical body? The human aspect of that creature would be just completely gone. But that's like the dream of the transhuman. It's really a diabolical dream. But a lot of people in Silicon Valley, etc., are pushing for this. And they see it as the future of humanity. So I'll finish there, but we have to pray. Pray very much for all these people involved in this terrible, terrible temptation of eugenics and transhumanism, and see them for what they are. As they promote abortion, etc., it's because they have this agenda behind it. Thank you very much.